How you doing, guys? Today we're going to install the crankshaft in the Magnum 16. And as you can see, I got it loosely affixed into the block at this point. Really, the only thing I did was I just slid it into the bearing itself. But in order to install the crankshaft, we got to first document or measure what the crankshaft end play is going to be. And according to the Kohler Magnum manual, if we look at the top left, it says crankshaft. The first thing down is crankshaft end play. We slide all the way over to the far right. We look at the model M16, and the clearance is set to 3 to 20 thousandths. So that's a pretty big spread. And the reason for that, I think, is number one, you got to have some end play in the crankshaft itself, but we're also going to have to use a number of bearing plate gaskets, probably 2, of various thicknesses, to actually space out the bearing plate in such a way that this surface, this machine surface on the crankshaft, and this little surface, this inner surface right here of the bearing, ends up being clearanced 3 to 20 thousandths. But before we can do any of that, we have to install the crankshaft. We have to install the crankshaft so it's fully seated on the PTO bearing. So in other words, the machine surface at this end of the crankshaft is completely mated up on the PTO bearing. The next thing we need to do is I'm going to put this over here. Hopefully it'll stay. Sorry about that. Let me just get my flashlight. We'll get the camera to focus here, hopefully. Come on. We can do it. There it is. So if you look on the crankshaft, you see that there is a timing mark right here, and then there's a timing mark right there. The lower one is larger, and that is the primary timing mark for the timing of the engine. The upper mark is actually for the balance gears, or timing one of the balance gears, and we're not going to do that. So we're not going to use that timing mark. So we take the primary timing mark, and as you can see, it is in line with the timing mark on the camshaft. So I know we have the crankshaft and the camshaft timed correctly. And now we can go get the gaskets and start putting this together. Real quick before we move on to the next aspect of installing the crankshaft, I have to rotate it around in order to do the measurement properly. But in doing so, I was able to really show the timing marks on the crankshaft. And as I indicated, there's a large timing mark and a small timing mark, basically the one on top, the one on the bottom. The big one is the primary timing mark. That's the one that will be used to time the camshaft. And if you were going to install the balance gears, you're going to use the little timing mark in order to do that. I'm not putting the the balance gears into this motor, therefore we can disregard that and I just used the large timing mark to time the camshaft. So I took the bearing plate gaskets out of my gasket kit, and you can see there's a whole bunch of them there in the kit, and they're different colors, and the different colors actually correlates to the thickness of the gaskets themselves. I'll use my dial calipers to figure out the thickness overall for the gasket, so I'll measure each one of these and write it down on a piece of paper. I'm not going to use all these gaskets. I'm only going to use maybe maximum 3, but I'm going to start off with probably the thickest one and the medium thickness one, which is this one right there, if I'm correct. And I'll mount the bearing plate with those 2 gaskets on the block using, obviously, the cleaned bolts. So here's a little tidbit. You're supposed to fully torque the bearing plate to the block with the gaskets and then get your feeler gauge and figure out or measure the end play right here from this face to the bearing face right here. What I'll do is typically I'll just tighten down the bearing plate. I won't torque it to the final spec. And the reason for that is this. When you torque these gaskets down and you find out that you're a little too tight, and you have to take it all apart again, you tend to destroy these gaskets. So by just tightening it down, you're going to alleviate the issue of destroying the gaskets if you need to take it apart. But with that being said, by tightening it down, you do want to keep in mind that the reading that you get here, okay, will end up about maybe 2 to 3 thousandths tighter when you physically torque the bearing plate down. So I'm going to take the 2 thickest gaskets, mount the bearing plate, bolt the bearing plate down with the gaskets, and I'm going to tighten it down. Just snug it all down, crisscross pattern. Then I'm going to take a measurement of the clearance. If I'm going to hope that I'm at the high end of the specification, okay? And then with that, I'm not going to remove the bearing plate. I'm just going to torque it down and then remeasure it. And as long as I'm at the high end of the measurement, basically close to maybe 20 to 15 thousandths, when I crush it down by torquing it, it'll be with, I'll still have more than 3 thousandths clearance. So that's the trick that I use. So that way you don't destroy gaskets and then end up having to buy more or whatever. It just seems to work best. Now, if I measure this and I find that I'm too tight, even with the 2 gaskets, I'm going to be able to take this apart, and usually my gaskets will be fine. They won't be ripped up or really squashed down or anything to that effect. Obviously, if it's too tight, too loose, then I'm going to have to take it apart and then swap out to one of these thinner gaskets in order to get me where I need to be. Plus, if you measure all your gaskets first, write them down on a piece of paper, and you're a little bit too loose, then you can really dial it in and figure out how many of these thinner gaskets you're going to need in order to get to specification. And then you can just send it home. You can just torque it right into place. So I'm going to just kind of fiddle around with this real quick to see which gasket, gasket thicknesses I'm going to need, and I'll be right back. The bearing plate is installed. It ended up using 4 gaskets. Typically, these gaskets are different thicknesses. There's like a 15, a 10, or something to that effect. But this particular kit, which is aftermarket, by the way, had all 10 thousandths gaskets. All of them. Even though they were different colors, it didn't matter. I think I even got some oil on this one. But it didn't matter. They were all 10 thousandths. And it ended up taking 4 of these gaskets, right down in there, to get 4 thousandths clearance. And that's what I have. I have a 4 thousandths feeler gauge in there. And what I did was I torqued the bearing plate into in 3 stages. I just snugged them down, took a reading. It was like about 5 thousandths. And I was like, all right, let's see how this goes. I really didn't want to put 5 gaskets between the bearing plate and the block, but you got to do what you got to do. So I torqued it to 10, measured it, was 4 thousandths, torqued it to 20, and it was still 4 thousandths. So then I just went full send, and constantly crisscrossing my torquing. I torqued it to 35 foot-pounds, which is what Kohler calls for. And it is still, it's 4 thousandths. It just barely slides out. So it's at the tight end of the Kohler manual, because the Kohler manual says 3 to 20, and we're going to be at 4. So there's not much I can do with that. I really don't want to go I don't want to put another 10 thousandths gasket in there. With 5 gaskets, it's probably going to leak oil. Not that it won't leak oil at this point in time, but at least I know I got enough clearance there. I used my little dead blow hammer, and I knocked the crankshaft this direction, and then I knocked it this way and back and forth in order to get that measurement 3 or 4 times. and it's consistently come back to the 4,000s with some nice drag in there. So I'm going to leave it like that. It's going to, the end play of the crankshaft is going to be 4,000s. And if you grab the crank and kind of rock it back and forth by hand, you actually hear the little knock, 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 knock. It's not loud, obviously, but just enough. All right, next up, we're going to put the rod and the piston in the motor. Oh, and you know what? Now that I think about it, I think I'm going to do that in another video. So, as always, thank you very much for your support. Please subscribe. Give this a thumbs up if you found it helpful and if you enjoyed the video. And as always, have a great day.